For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat behind the desk of The Tonight Show and talked to over 22,000 guests. He interviewed movie stars, politicians, comedians, musicians, and regular people with strange talents. Carson was famous for being calm, funny, and professional, no matter what happened during his show. But even the best host in television history had his breaking point. Some guests were just difficult to interview. Maybe they were boring, or maybe they didn't understand how talk shows worked. Carson could handle those situations easily, but other guests went way beyond difficult. They were rude, hostile, offensive, or just plain disrespectful to Carson, his crew, and the millions of people watching at home. These are the 9 guests who treated Johnny Carson and his show with the most disrespect. These interviews became legendary among Tonight Show staff members, and some of them still make people uncomfortable to watch decades later. Number 1. Robert Blake, the man with the death stare. Robert Blake was a talented actor. He starred in the movie In Cold Blood and had his own popular TV show called Beretta. People respected his acting skills and thought he would make an interesting guest on The Tonight Show. Nobody expected what actually happened when Blake sat down in the guest chair. From the very first moment, something felt wrong. Blake didn't come on the show to have a friendly conversation. He came with an attitude that can only be described as hostile. When Carson asked normal, friendly questions, Blake would give short, mean answers. Sometimes he would just stare at Carson with cold, dead eyes and say things like, "Why would you ask me that?" in an angry tone. One writer who worked on the show that night remembered how uncomfortable it was. Blake didn't just seem unfriendly, the writer said. He seemed angry. It felt like he wanted to fight Johnny, not talk to him. The whole studio could feel it. The studio audience didn't know what to do. Usually they laughed at jokes and clapped for the guests. But during Blake's interview, they just sat there in silence. The band members looked uncomfortable. Even Ed McMahon, who sat next to Carson every night and had seen everything, seemed worried. What made Blake's behavior so disturbing wasn't loud anger or yelling. It was the cold, controlled way he acted. He barely moved. He barely blinked. He just sat there, staring at Carson with empty eyes, speaking in a calm voice that somehow sounded threatening. The words coming out of his mouth were hostile, but his voice stayed eerily quiet. A camera operator who filmed the interview said, "There was something really creepy about how still Blake was. Most angry people move around, wave their hands, raise their voice. Blake just sat there like a statue with these dead eyes, staring at Johnny like he was thinking about hurting him." Carson tried everything he could think of. He asked different types of questions. He tried to make jokes to lighten the mood. He tried being sincere and serious. Nothing worked. Blake responded to everything with the same cold hostility. People who knew Carson well could see how uncomfortable he was, even though he tried to hide it. He smiled, but the smile looked tight and forced. He looked at his note cards more than usual, which he did when he was nervous. He sat as far away from Blake as possible without making it obvious. After the show ended, Carson talked to his producer. "I felt like I was being studied," Carson said. "It wasn't like talking to another person. It was like being examined by a predator." Blake wasn't unfriendly in a normal way. He was sizing me up, watching me like a specimen under a microscope. The experience bothered Carson so much that he made sure Blake never came back on the show again. Years later, when Blake got in trouble with the law, Carson reportedly said to a colleague, "I'm not surprised. There was something genuinely disturbing about that man. I've rarely felt so relieved to end an interview." Number 2. Andy Kaufman as Tony Clifton. Total chaos. Andy Kaufman was a comedian who loved to confuse people. He didn't just tell jokes. He created weird characters and situations that made people uncomfortable on purpose. His most famous character was Tony Clifton, a terrible lounge singer who wore a bad wig, cheap sunglasses, and too much cologne. When Kaufman appeared on The Tonight Show as Tony Clifton, it went beyond comedy into something genuinely disrespectful. Most difficult guests are accidentally rude or just having a bad day. Clifton was designed to be as obnoxious and offensive as possible. Clifton showed up already in character. He smelled like he had dumped an entire bottle of cologne on himself. He was rude to the staff members backstage. He insulted people. And when he finally walked out on stage and sat down next to Carson, things got even worse. Clifton broke every rule of how guests were supposed to act on The Tonight Show. He interrupted Carson constantly. He insulted Ed McMahon. He made crude, inappropriate comments about women who worked on the show. He refused to let Carson guide the conversation the way a host is supposed to. A writer who was there that night remembered, "It wasn't just that Clifton was annoying. There was something genuinely unsettling about watching someone refuse to break character, no matter what happened. Carson would try to have a normal conversation, and Clifton would respond with random, nonsensical statements in this horrible, grating voice." The really disturbing part was that nobody could tell if Kaufman was still in control of the character, or if the character had somehow taken over completely. Was this still a performance, or had something gone wrong? Things reached the breaking point when Clifton decided to sing. The band played music to accompany him, but Clifton didn't like how they sounded. So he picked up his glass of water and threw it toward Doc Severinsen, the musical director. That was the moment Carson had enough. In an extremely unusual move, Carson stood up and walked off his own stage. He just left. Carson never walked off. That's how bad things had gotten. A stage manager who was there said, "When Johnny walked off, we all knew this was serious." Clifton got even worse after that. When it was time for a commercial break, he refused to leave the stage. Security guards had to physically grab him and remove him while he shouted curse words. It went way beyond uncomfortable television. It was like watching someone have a mental breakdown, except you knew it was an act, which somehow made it even more disturbing. When Carson came back after the commercial, everyone could see he was tense and rattled. Carson was almost never rattled on camera. That's how disrespectful and chaotic Clifton's behavior had been. Later, Carson talked to his staff about what had happened. "I've dealt with drunk guests," he said. "I've dealt with people with huge egos. I've dealt with people having meltdowns. But there was something genuinely unsettling about someone who refuses to acknowledge reality. It was like talking to someone from a different universe with completely different rules." The result was immediate. Andy Kaufman himself was still welcome on the show. He came back several times as himself and was a perfectly good guest. But Carson personally requested that the Tony Clifton character be permanently banned from ever appearing again. As one producer explained, Johnny could handle difficult, but he couldn't handle disturbing, and Clifton crossed that line. Number 3. Klaus Kinsky. The Human Time Bomb. Klaus Kinsky was a German actor famous for intense, frightening performances in movies. He was known for having a terrible temper and unpredictable behavior. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s, Carson encountered a level of rage and intensity that genuinely scared everyone in the studio. From the second Kinsky walked onto the stage, something felt dangerous. A stage manager who was working that night remembered, there was this crackling, dangerous energy around him. His eyes were wide and bulging, and they never blinked. His whole body was trembling like he was holding back an explosion. Johnny, who normally leaned toward guests to show he was listening, was actually leaning away from Kinsky the whole time. Kinsky didn't answer Carson's questions like a normal guest. When Carson asked about his recent movie, Kinsky started rambling about art, religion, and the end of the world. His answers had nothing to do with what Carson asked, and the way he spoke was intense and almost violent. When Carson tried to make a light joke to ease the tension, Kinsky fixed him with such a hostile, angry stare that people in the audience actually gasped out loud. They could feel the danger. Behind the scenes, the show's staff was seriously worried. A producer said, "We had security people on high alert that night. We weren't sure if Kinsky would finish the interview or flip the desk over. During the commercial break, we actually talked about whether we should end the segment early for safety reasons." Johnny was incredibly tense. We could see him trying to figure out exactly how to handle this unstable person without setting him off. The interview continued, with Carson staying calm on the outside while clearly creating as much physical distance as possible between himself and Kinsky. After the show, Carson admitted to friends that it was the only time he seriously thought a guest might become physically violent on live television. Ed McMahon later talked about that night in an interview. "Johnny told me he felt like he was sitting next to a bomb that could explode any second," McMahon said. "He wasn't conducting an interview so much as trying to prevent a public meltdown. He said he'd never been so relieved to go to a commercial break in his life." What really disturbed Carson were Kinsky's eyes. They never blinked, and they stared with such intense focus that it felt threatening. A camera operator remembered. Johnny said later that looking into Kinsky's eyes was like watching a storm coming straight at you. You could feel the destructive power building, and you knew something terrible was about to happen. After that night, the Kinsky appearance became famous among Tonight Show staff as the worst example of dangerous intensity. For years afterward, whenever a potentially difficult guest was scheduled, producers would try to reassure Carson by saying, "At least it can't be worse than Kinsky." The disrespect in Kinsky's case wasn't just rudeness. It was his complete disregard for normal human interaction and his threatening energy that made everyone fear for their safety. That kind of behavior went far beyond the usual talk show difficulties. Number 4. Truman Capote. Lost in Another World. Truman Capote was one of America's greatest writers. He wrote famous books like In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. His unique voice and personality made him popular on talk shows during the 1960s and early 1970s. But as Capote's problems with alcohol and drugs got worse, his appearances on The Tonight Show became increasingly disrespectful and disturbing. During one particularly bad appearance in 1975, Capote arrived clearly drunk. He was so intoxicated that he could barely speak clearly. His words were slurred, and he kept trailing off in the middle of sentences, staring into space, then suddenly continuing as if no time had passed. A director who worked on that show said, "Capote had this quality that really unnerved Johnny. He would speak in this very soft, whispery voice, stop talking mid-sentence for these long pauses, then suddenly continue. Johnny said it was like trying to interview a ghost who kept fading in and out." Instead of being the witty, entertaining guest Carson expected, Capote launched into rambling stories about death, celebrity, secrets, and paranormal experiences. Nothing he said made sense. The stories didn't connect to each other or to anything Carson asked him. A camera operator who worked that night remembered, "The audience didn't know whether to laugh or be worried. Capote was slurring his words so badly you could barely understand him. But it wasn't just that. There was something almost ghost-like about his presence. He kept staring past Johnny into empty space, then smiling at nothing. Johnny kept looking where Capote was looking, clearly unnerved by it. The interview became so incoherent and disrespectful to the show's format that producers made a rare decision to cut it short. During the commercial break, Carson turned to his producer and said, "He sounds like a haunted house whispering its own life story." When the show came back from commercial, Carson announced that Capote wasn't feeling well and quickly moved on to the next guest. What made Capote's behavior particularly disrespectful wasn't just being drunk on television. Carson had dealt with impaired guests before. It was the combination of his physical frailty, his whispered intensity, and the disturbing content of his rambling stories. One writer who was there said, "Capote was telling these half-coherent stories about people he claimed died under mysterious circumstances, then giggling softly. Johnny kept trying to lighten the mood and make it normal, but Capote would just stare at him with this unsettling smile and whisper, 'You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?' It was deeply uncomfortable." After the show, Carson talked to his staff about the experience. A longtime colleague remembered, Johnny said, "I don't mind difficult guests, but that was like interviewing someone who's halfway into the afterlife already." He was genuinely creeped out and disturbed, which almost never happened. The experience was so bad that Carson temporarily banned Capote from the guest list. It wasn't meant as punishment. Carson just found the experience so genuinely disturbing that he didn't want to repeat it. When Capote was eventually invited back years later, the show took strict precautions to make sure he was in better condition, but Carson remained cautious and wary throughout that interview. Number 5. George Jessel, the Racist Relic. George Jessel was an old vaudeville performer whose career went back to the early 1900s. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, he was in his 70s and represented an era of entertainment that had long since passed. What Carson didn't expect was that Jessel would create one of the most offensive and disrespectful moments in the show's entire history. Jessel came from a time when racist jokes were common in entertainment, But by the 1970s, those kinds of jokes weren't just unfunny, they were appalling and offensive. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show current and respectful, was completely blindsided by what came out of Jessel's mouth. A writer who was there explained, Carson introduced Jessel and invited him to share some thoughts about his long career. Instead of light, interesting stories, Jessel launched into what can only be described as a greatest hits collection of the most offensive material imaginable. His monologue was filled with racist terms, stereotypes, and humor that might have passed in the 1920s, but was shocking and horrifying to a 1970s audience. The reaction in the studio was immediate. A camera operator remembered, the studio went completely silent. Not the kind of silence where people don't get a joke. The horrified silence where everyone is collectively thinking, did he really just say that? Johnny's face froze in this pained smile. You could see him frantically trying to figure out how to stop this disaster without creating an even bigger scene. What made it even more disrespectful was Jessel's complete obliviousness. As the audience sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence, Jessel continued as if he expected huge laughs. He looked confused when the laughs didn't come, but he just kept going with more offensive material. Carson was trapped in an impossible situation. A producer who was in the control booth that night explained, if Johnny directly confronted Jessel about the offensive material, it would create an awkward on-air confrontation with an elderly man. If he laughed it off, he would seem to be agreeing with these horrible views. If he abruptly cut the segment, it would be obviously clear why. Johnny was visibly uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Carson's solution was to cut to a commercial break much earlier than planned. When the show returned from the commercial, Jessel was gone. He had been replaced by the next scheduled guest. No explanation was given. Backstage, Carson was unusually upset. Staff members said he was angrier than they'd almost ever seen him. He told his producer, "That was not what this show is about. That kind of thing is never happening again on my watch. Never." Unlike many difficult guests who were eventually invited back after time passed, Jessel was permanently removed from Carson's guest list. The incident was so bad that it prompted the show to implement more thorough pre-interviews, especially for guests from earlier eras of entertainment who might not understand what was acceptable anymore. A longtime colleague of Carson's said, what disturbed Johnny most wasn't just the offensive content, though that was bad enough. It was the way Jessel seemed to be a visitor from another time who didn't recognize how the world had changed. There was something genuinely creepy about someone who seemed completely disconnected from reality. The Jessel incident became a reference point for the production team. Whenever potentially problematic guests were suggested, someone would inevitably ask, "But could we have another Jessel situation?" Just mentioning his name was enough to make the booking staff reconsider a guest. Number 6. Andy Warhol, The Silent Treatment. Andy Warhol's appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s was one of the most conceptually disrespectful interviews Carson ever attempted. Warhol didn't yell or insult anyone. He didn't throw things or get drunk. Instead, he simply refused to participate in basic conversation, and that refusal felt like a profound insult to the entire premise of the show. A producer who worked on that segment explained, Warhol's appearance was more like a performance art piece than an interview. He barely spoke. When he did speak, he gave one-word answers. He stared blankly at Carson as if he wasn't there. It created this incredibly uncomfortable atmosphere that even Johnny, with all his experience, couldn't fix. From the moment Warhol sat down, the normal rhythm of The Tonight Show was completely disrupted. Carson would ask full, thoughtful questions designed to give Warhol interesting things to talk about. Warhol would respond with a single word, or sometimes just a nod. Then he would stare at Carson with unblinking eyes for long, uncomfortable periods of silence. When Carson tried to use humor to break the tension and make things more comfortable, Warhol would give a tiny, mysterious smile that acknowledged the joke without actually engaging with it. He was physically present, but emotionally and intellectually absent. A camera operator who was there that night remembered, the audience didn't know how to react. Was this supposed to be funny? Was Warhol being deliberately difficult? Was he incredibly shy? The uncertainty created this creeping discomfort that spread through the entire studio. People shifted in their seats. They coughed nervously. They looked around at each other as if asking, "Is this as weird as it feels?" Carson tried every interviewing technique he had learned over decades of hosting. He asked open-ended questions that were easy to answer. He asked specific questions about Warhol's artwork. He told personal stories meant to encourage Warhol to share his own stories. He even directly commented on how unusual the conversation was. Nothing worked. Nothing penetrated Warhol's wall of detached observation. A writer who was backstage remembered one particularly uncomfortable moment. At one point, Johnny directly asked, "Do you even want to be here?" Warhol just shrugged slightly. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just shrugged. It was like trying to interview a statue. Johnny later joked off the air, "That man could be made of wax." But you could tell he was genuinely upset by the experience. What made Warhol's disrespect different from other difficult guests was the complete absence of normal human interaction. He wasn't hostile like Robert Blake. He wasn't drunk like Capote. He wasn't manic like Kinsky. Instead, his presence created what one staff member described as an existential vacuum that seemed to distort the normal flow of time. A director who worked that night said, "It wasn't hostility. It was existential dread." Johnny relied on the basic human connection that comes from conversation. That's how talk shows work, and Warhol refused to participate in that fundamental exchange. Carson later said the experience felt like interviewing a ghost who knew something you didn't. It was genuinely eerie. In many ways, Warhol's appearance represented the perfect opposite of everything The Tonight Show stood for. Instead of warmth, he offered coldness. Instead of connection, he offered disconnection. Instead of entertainment, he offered discomfort. For Carson, whose entire career was built on establishing easy rapport with guests, the experience was deeply disturbing. After the segment ended, Carson was both annoyed and fascinated. A producer who talked to him afterward remembered, he said, "Either that was the worst interview I've ever done, or it was brilliant performance art, and I'm not sure which would bother me more." He seemed genuinely shaken by the interaction. Not angry exactly, but disturbed on a fundamental level. Warhol's appearance became legendary among Tonight Show staff as the ultimate example of uncomfortable silence and disrespectful non-participation. Carson occasionally mentioned other difficult guests in later years, but he rarely brought up the Warhol interview, as if the experience had been too fundamentally unsettling to revisit. Number 7. Charles Grodin. The professional antagonist comedian and actor Charles Grodin developed a shtick where he would playfully antagonize Johnny Carson during his appearances on The Tonight Show. Sometimes this created funny, entertaining television, but other times, Grodin's act crossed the line from playful into genuinely disrespectful. Grodin's approach was to challenge everything Carson said and did. He would question Carson's questions. He would mock Carson's hosting style. He would create deliberately awkward pauses and uncomfortable moments. The idea was that this tension would be funny, and sometimes it was funny. When both Carson and the audience were in on the joke, Grodin's antagonistic character could create comedy gold, but other times it felt less like performance and more like genuine rudeness. During one appearance, Grodin spent the entire interview complaining that he should have been booked on a different night. He acted put out and annoyed to be there. When Carson tried to move the conversation forward, Grodin would bring it back to his complaints. The joke wore thin quickly, and what might have been funny for a minute or two became uncomfortable as it stretched on. Another time, Grodin interrupted Carson repeatedly and talked over him. When Carson tried to ask a question, Grodin would start talking before he could finish. The bit was supposed to be that Grodin was so self-absorbed he couldn't let anyone else speak, but it came across as genuinely rude to the host. A writer who worked on several of Grodin's appearances said, "The problem with Charles's act was that the line between performance and genuine disrespect was very thin. He was playing a character who was rude to Johnny, but at the end of the day, he was actually being rude to Johnny. Some nights it worked, some nights it didn't." What made Grodin's approach particularly tricky was that Carson could never be sure how far to push back. If he pushed back too hard, he would look like he couldn't take a joke. If he didn't push back at all, he looked like he was being walked over on his own show. It put Carson in an uncomfortable position. Carson generally tolerated Grodin's act because he understood it was meant to be comedy. But there were definitely moments during Grodin's appearances when you could see Carson's smile get a little tighter and his responses get a little sharper. The playful tension occasionally felt more like real tension. Number 8. Joan Rivers, the ultimate betrayal. Joan Rivers was one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests. He championed her career, had her on the show dozens of times, and eventually made her his permanent guest host. When Carson took nights off, Rivers would fill in for him. She was funny, professional, and seemed genuinely grateful for Carson's support. Then, in 1986, Rivers did something that Carson considered the ultimate disrespect. She accepted a deal to host her own competing late-night show on Fox. This alone wouldn't have been unforgivable. What made it unforgivable was that she didn't tell Carson herself. He found out about it from the media. Carson felt deeply betrayed. He had given Rivers her big break in television. He had supported her career for years. He had trusted her enough to let her host his show. And she had repaid that trust by taking a competing job without even having the courtesy to tell him personally. Rivers tried to call Carson to explain, but he refused to take her calls. He never spoke to her again for the rest of his life. When people asked him about it, he would simply say that Rivers knew what she did. The disrespect here wasn't about an on-air interview going badly. It was about a fundamental breach of professional courtesy and personal loyalty. Carson felt that after everything he had done for Rivers, she owed him at least a phone call before he read about her new show in the newspaper. Years later, Rivers expressed deep regret about how she handled the situation. She said that not calling Carson personally was one of the biggest mistakes of her life, but by then, it was too late. Carson had made up his mind, and he never changed it. Number 9. Frank Sinatra, the intimidating legend. Frank Sinatra was one of the biggest stars in American entertainment history. When he appeared on The Tonight Show, it was always a big event. But Sinatra had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, and sometimes intimidating. While Sinatra was generally cordial with Carson on camera, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Sinatra expected special treatment. He wanted things done his way, and if something didn't meet his high standards, he could turn cold or hostile without warning. Carson had to carefully navigate Sinatra's moods. The wrong question or the wrong joke could make Sinatra shut down or become defensive. This made interviewing him stressful, even though Sinatra was usually professional on camera. Behind the scenes, Sinatra could be demanding with the staff. He had specific requirements about everything from his dressing room to how he was introduced. If something wasn't exactly as he wanted it, he would let people know he was displeased. The disrespect with Sinatra was more subtle than with other guests on this list. It wasn't outright rudeness so much as an attitude that he was above the normal rules. He was Frank Sinatra, and everyone else should accommodate him. Carson, who treated all his guests with the same professional courtesy regardless of their fame, sometimes found Sinatra's attitude challenging. But because Sinatra was such a huge star and so important to the show's ratings, Carson tolerated behavior he might not have accepted from other guests. These 9 guests showed that even the most professional, experienced host in television history couldn't always overcome genuine disrespect. Whether through hostility, chaos, offensive content, non-participation, or personal betrayal, these guests tested Carson's legendary patience and professionalism. What makes these stories significant is how they reveal Carson's remarkable ability to maintain composure even in the most difficult situations. He almost never lost his cool on camera. He almost never showed when guests had truly gotten under his skin. But in private, he would admit when someone had crossed the line from difficult to disrespectful. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson remains one of the greatest achievements in television history, largely because Carson made it look so easy. These difficult guests remind us that it wasn't always easy, and that maintaining grace under pressure was one of Carson's greatest talents.